We're now going to move to the standard set for question 3. Question 3 on this paper is analyse how the writer uses language and structure to interest and engage readers. The question is always the same on this particular paper, and unlike paper 1, the students need to answer on the whole extract, and there are 15 marks available across 5 levels. So this does differ to paper 1 in this particular mark scheme. The important things to remember are that students do need to comment on both language and structure in order to move higher than level 2. Very few students we find do tend to comment only on one or the other, but we do find some students do confuse what is structure. They might say this writer uses an adverb, which is structure, and get a little bit confused about technical terms. Students do need to make sure they're considering what the impact of whatever language and structure feature they are picking out is having on the reader. And in order to move higher than those typical level 3 responses, they need to be thinking more than just to encourage the reader to read on or to interest the reader. They do need to be doing a little bit more than that in order to achieve higher than a level 3. Features to look out for. It's very tempting for students to look out for very typical features of language that they know, like alliteration and personification, and typical features of structure like lists and repetition. But some advice that I would give is to think about the type of text that you're reading and why a writer might use particular language and structure features in order to engage a reader in a particular sense. Best responses do think about the type of text that the extract is coming from, and also thinks about how to pick out discriminating references. Discriminating references are what really identifies the level 5 answer. There's a lot of extract to get through, and rather than go through the extract commenting language feature by language feature as you see it, pick out the ones that you think are impacting most on the person reading the text and how they're doing that. That's the best advice we can give. So if we move to script 1 first, the answer starts: in this autobiography, the writer uses language and structure to effectively engage the reader. One piece of advice we always give and we always say to examiners is tell students not to repeat the question at the start. They should just use their time efficiently, get straight into the business of commenting on language and structure. Save yourselves time, pack in as much as you can into your answer as possible. This particular student's response is mainly focused on structural points. They talk about lists, they talk about repetition, but there is some brief language comment at the end of the response where they have commented on tone. Angelou's conversational yet informative tone makes the reader feel almost at ease and maintains a friendly vibe throughout. So there's a brief language comment there at the end, but it is relatively brief, and you will have noted what I said earlier about try to go beyond the makes the reader feel at ease or interested or engaged, because that's fairly obvious in terms of what the question is asking. At this point, we need to consider how we apply a levels-based mark scheme. And this is always a challenge for examiners to think, where does this answer best fit into the mark scheme? We know that the students commented both on language and structure, even though language is only just touched upon. There is language there. There is no requirement for students to comment equally or in a balanced way on both language and structure. So we move to our mark scheme and we look at the levels within the mark scheme. What we find in our mark scheme is some indicative content, and that is just indicative content. It's just possible points that students might pick up. It's not exhaustive. If a student's picked up a different point to any of these points, that's absolutely fine. It's just there to give teachers like yourselves some ideas about what we would suggest students are commenting on. The levels-based mark scheme here is level 1 to level 5, and what typically exemplifies a level 1 response is what we would describe as limited. And if you're thinking, is this particular answer more than limited, then you're thinking, I need to look at level 2 here. If you're thinking level 2, then is there comment? And the discrimination between commenting, explaining, and analysing is a very important one, because commenting is a level 2 skill, explaining is level 3, moving from that explaining into exploring in more detail and with greater depth is level 4. And then analysis of the text, that real key, moving back to what is the purpose of this text, who is the audience for this text, that's where you move into your analysis. So where I would suggest examiners start, and experienced examiners know this, but if new examiners are starting out, I would say, okay, so this response has some examples of language and very briefly, and a couple of examples of structural features. So it meets level 2. It's more than just limited comment. The candidate says, this makes it easy to read. Not only this, but gives the impression to the reader of how little access they had to things during the Depression, as it is able to fit into a list. That's more than just commenting. It's moving into trying to explain the effect of the list. So there's comment on the text, that is evident. So that bullet point in level 2 is met. There is comment on language and structure. Language is very brief at the end, but there is comment. And they have also included valid references. And more than just not developed references, they have done that. So in order to achieve, where would we put this in the standard? We would say, well, it has met all of level 2. And because it's met level 2, we need to look at whether it's met any of the bullet points in level 3. And we felt as a standard that it had only just. It's not a strong level 3 response. It's not a particularly bordering on level 4, level 3 response. But we can see that it does meet level 2 fully, and it just moves into level 3 with a mark of 7. Because there's a little bit of explanation, a little bit. It doesn't go any further than that, so that's why it stays at a mark of 7. Moving on to script 2. Again, advice I would give to students and teachers, and things that you can feed back to your students, are remember which assessment objectives are being assessed in different questions. This student starts out by saying the writer successfully uses language and structure to interest and engage the reader. They're hedging their bets a little bit. They're thinking, do I need to talk about evaluation here, which is actually question 6? Do I need to talk about language and structure here, which is question 3? They don't need to comment on how successfully the writer is doing something. That's more of a question 6 response. And again, they're repeating a little bit of the question, which they don't need to do. Move straight into the business of your language and structure. The first part of the response, in the beginning of the extract, the writer immediately refers to the Depression having hit in quotation marks, people with cyclonic impact, again in quotation marks. The adjective cyclonic implies that the depression was so sudden that America was left in chaos and ruin, as a cyclone is an extremely destructive storm. This hyperbole effectively interests the reader as it emphasises how the depression left many people in ruin and perhaps foreshadows their lack of basic items later on in the extract. So straight away you're feeling this kind of is definitely explaining. They are definitely explaining the language points there. There's quite a bit packed into that example, even though it's just the one example. The adjective cyclonic, the hyperbole is mentioned there, and even the little bit about foreshadowing the lack of basic items is and it's an explained point. You may also be thinking as you start to read this response, I think this is starting to explore this answer. There is some exploration going on here. The candidate does comment on structure. They've commented on a list that emphasises the destructiveness of the cyclonic impact of the depression because they're common household items, effectively mirroring the consequences of real cyclones. So you can see the language points are there, structure points are there. The student is exploring the chronology of the text. That is an important point that can be made as a structural point. Students can comment on where the extract starts and where it ends up. That is a valid structural point. It's not just about lists and questions and statements, commands. Structure in terms of how the text is put together is also important to comment on. They're embedding their references throughout the answer in order to support the points. And there is some detail in the level of appropriate reference that is there. For example, in the beginning of the extract, it shows how the depression seeped into their home like a thief with misgivings. So they've got seeped, they've got like a thief with misgivings, they've then got hit, and they've embedded quotations throughout, they've embedded their references throughout there. The connection to the reader is more explained than it is explored. There is exploration of the text, but in terms of what they say about the language and structure, things like this effectively interests the reader as it is clear that the depression was an extremely difficult time for all families. That's more of an explained point than it is an explored point. But we can definitely see that if we again apply our where would we fit this response, is there explanation of the text? There's definitely explanation of the text. It doesn't go to the lengths that we would say they've picked out discriminating references across the whole text in order to achieve a level 5, but it definitely explains particular parts of the text. It's explaining how both language and structure are used, and the references that they've used are appropriate and relevant to the points being made. In that case, this answer has met the bullet points of level 3. We'd then discuss the fact that there is some achievement of level 4 here. There are touches of exploration of the text. Not quite necessarily how language and structure impact on readers, but there's definitely exploration of some of the ideas in the text. The idea of the depression not discriminating, for example. There is also some detailed reference offered, which is some achievement of that third bullet point in level 4. On the basis of that, we would say that if you apply a best fit to this answer, there's some exploration, which is the first bullet point in level 4, and there's some detailed reference, which is the third bullet point in level 4, and we awarded a mark of 11 for this particular answer. Moving on to script 3. This is another answer where the student has spent a little bit of time confusing their assessment objectives. Throughout this text, the writer successfully uses language and structure to engage the reader, and they are repeating again the question. So encourage students to move straight into talking about language and structure, which is important. They start talking about repetition of the word depression and how that sets quite a dark and gloomy tone. So there's a little bit of structure and language in that point. And they then move into commenting on this is juxtaposed at the end, as at the end of the text, a more hopeful tone is introduced, as it says we were always given enough to eat, showing that they are comfortable with their position and are hopeful for the future. It's a little bit there is an element of exploration there. It's explained that point and has gone into a little bit of explanation there. They then lose a little bit of track because they then say the writer uses broken up paragraphs to show a depthly story of the situation at the time. So this student's not fully confident with the point they're trying to make. They are trying to make a structural point, but not in a very confident way. First of all, in the first paragraph starts off by talking about depression and saying it seeped into the black area slowly. But this point doesn't really go anywhere. It's not really explained, which is what we'd expect in level 3. And then again, the answer tails off a little bit. Then in the second stanza, it builds upon it saying welfare agencies gave food to the poor families. Students just run out of time to then explore that point a bit more. So if you, as an examiner, are comparing that with the two scripts that you've already seen, there is a little bit of exploration at the start. And again, when you're applying a level-based mark scheme, you're looking at what best fits this answer. So there's a little bit of level 3/4 at the start, but then it sort of moves into being more level 2 towards the end. So it's a balance of crediting what is done well, but also recognising that there's a little bit of confusion and a little bit of underdeveloped comment there. So quotations on the top of the second page are not particularly developed or commented on, and the language point is explained with some exploration, an appropriate and relevant reference. There's little meaningful reference in this response to structure, and a best fit answer here, a best fit mark would be a mark of 8 in level 3. That reflects the fact that there is a little bit of level 4 achievement at the start, but also that there's a little bit of level 2 in there as well. So mark of 3, a level 3, mark of 8 for script 3. Script 4. This is a student who moves straight into the business of what the question asks, and credit for that. Angelo uses structural devices such as asyndetic lists. So straight away into, I'm going to comment on a structure point and start to talk about what the impact is on the reader. Hasn't wasted any time repeating the question, which is really useful. Providing an example, providing an accurate account of the lard, flour, salt, and other essentials given out by welfare agencies during the Depression. You can see a lot of reference in the opening to that particular piece, reinforced by the fact that no one had slop rich enough to feed their pigs, who are thought of as easy to feed. This creates a more realistic and matter-of-fact tone, causing the reader to believe Angelo more readily. So you can see that this student is exploring language, exploring the tone that's created, and exploring more than explaining the effect on the reader, creating a realistic, matter-of-fact tone. I mean, it's not slightly correct in the sense of causing the reader to believe Angela more readily, but we know what the student means there. There's some discriminating reference here. Angela also uses the dry humour of "at least" in relation to the depression not discriminating against black people. This shows the reader that the depression affected all races and helps them to understand the magnitude of the event. So they're really picking out references that they think are key to exploring their points about the magnitude of the depression and how it affects everyone. This is really important in the sense of really discriminating this answer from some of the answers that we've already seen. They're commenting on listing, realistic tone, dry humour, language used to create a sense of community as the answer moves on, and emotive language such as hated for the food she and Bailey were forced to eat. There is more that could be said about the language and structure within this particular response, but the student has selected the devices that they feel in a discriminating way illustrates the points that they want to make. And they do present some confident analysis of the text and the structure used. We agreed a mark of 14 for this particular answer. It can be a difficult question if, and it's a question that we would always ask ourselves when we're in pre-standardisation, why not 15? If it's 14, why would it not be 15? What stops it from getting to 15? And in some cases, there's not quite the security in the analysis. Some of the analysis is explored rather than confidently and securely analysed in order to achieve that top mark in level 5. You just want a little bit more in order to achieve a top mark. Not to say that 15 is absolutely perfection, but in terms of the range of points that they've included, we would expect to see a little bit more for 15. There's more that can be said about the points that this student's made. But this is a good level 5 response. So the final script to exemplify question 3, again, very sensibly moves straight into the business of looking at language. The writer uses a simile like a thief with misgiving. Lots of students picking up this particular language feature. Students do like to look for, so no pun intended, like to look for similes and also metaphors, alliteration, the kind of things that students look out for. And what we've got here is to emphasise and create a strong picture of the words thief and misgiving, contrast each other as thieves are typically not occasioned with doubts, as they are meant to be criminals. The use of the word like, making the phrase a simile, creates a stronger image in the reader's mind, as this represents the impact seeping into the black area slowly, engaging the reader. So there's quite a lot of words there, but not a great deal of explanation. They have picked a language feature and they've commented on it, but there's not a great deal to move it into exploration, for example. It is slightly superficial in its comment on the impact on the reader. It creates a strong picture, a stronger image in the reader's mind. This is a good example of an answer where you start off thinking, oh, I think this is roughly a level 2/3, but it improves as it moves on. The writer further engages the reader by using the adverb slowly to describe her mama's many nights of figuring. They then comment on the multiple commas, full stops, short paragraphs, and the impact of that on the pace of the particular extract. How that links to pace is has some exploration, not quite secure, but there's definitely explanation. This creates an almost fast pace to the reader, making it appear more intense. So this candidate's really trying to explain the effect of language there. Clearly and effectively represent a tense situation to the reader. So it's definitely explaining, going back to the question each time they are looking at a language or structure feature. Multiple short paragraphing to represent the sign her and her brother were asked to make. Capital letters to exaggerate the tense situation they are in, stressing the importance of trading and its impact on 1930s depression. That's quite an interesting point. And it's the kind of point that if you were marking that as a teacher in the classroom, you'd write, you know, a bit more, tell me more, explain that a bit more, which they clearly run out of time to do. But they have commented on language and structure. And if we look at that mark scheme then, bearing in mind that we did feel that the opening was maybe a little bit level 2-ish, does it meet level 2? Well, it does. There's comment on the text, there's comment on language and structure. The references are valid, and we can't say that they're not developed, because they are. There's a real intention to explain what those references are doing. Is this student explaining the text? Absolutely. They are attempting to make a very clear explanation of the elements of the text, the ideas in the text. That's definitely there. So they've achieved that first bullet point in level 3. Is there explanation of how both language and structure are used to achieve effects and influence readers? Yes. In some cases, you'd think I would like that student to have more tools to be able to just explain the effect on the reader a bit more, but they've definitely met that bullet point in level 3. Is their selection of references appropriate and relevant to the points being made? Yes. It does all of those things in level 3. Do we feel it does anything in level 4? No, it doesn't quite get there. It's on the borderline, but it's not quite there. We would always look at that borderline mark and think, should it be the next mark up? In this case, we've kept it at a mark of 9 because we feel like it's a good exemplification of a top level 3 response. It would be easy for us to be able to explain to that student what you need to do to move this answer into level 4. And that's why we've given it a mark of 9. The next section of the video is us looking at the agreed standard for question 6. A key point to make here is that students and teachers and examiners really get very, very worried about what evaluation is and what you need to do in this particular question. As we've said before in training, we evaluate every day, even more so with online feedback and posting views about things online. So students are used to doing this. It's just that in this question, they see it expressed in a different way. So they need to get used to approaching the question and thinking about what they're being asked to do. Encourage your students to read the question. So in this case, the question asks, in this extract, the writer attempts to show the importance of working together as a community. Evaluate how successfully this is achieved. So in this case, the first thing for students to do is to decide whether they think the writer has done this or not. They come up with their opinion and they then need to express what their views are as to how well the writer has done that. It also is important to think about how they are expressing their evaluation. If you say, this is done cleverly, would it encourage other people to agree with you? Not necessarily. So some students feel that I've given a lot of evaluative adverbs. I've said cleverly and vividly and successfully and effectively. But have you really given an overall informed judgment? Have you reached that level of detached and critical overview which is needed to achieve level 5? It's really important to think about the opinion that the students have given. What do you think honestly about how successful the writer is at doing this? If you think that they're not, you can say that absolutely. It doesn't have to be an agreed they are always successful at doing this. As examiners, we need to look out for where students are commenting on their own views, but also potentially thinking about the views of other readers. So think about where the text is coming from and who the audience is, and think about if someone else read it, would they agree with you or would they not, and the reasons why that might be. If you as an examiner are thinking about awarding a mark in level 5, you're looking to see has the student used discriminating examples? Have they worked across the whole text, which is required for this particular answer? And have they made comments that seem like they're offering a detached critical overview, not just a bit of an add-on of evaluative vocabulary that makes a comment seem as if it's an evaluation? Examiners also consider what's in the mark scheme, the idea of setting ideas, theme and events, but they're not the only approaches to answering the question. They're just given as examples that students could comment on in the text that they're reading. If you see that broadly as comment or exploration or explanation of the text, because some will be more relevant than others in particular texts. Sight can help inform teaching strategies, but it's not the only approach to go for. So let's have a look at script 1 and the question 6 response in script 1. This particular student starts out very clearly identifying that they think the writer is successful. The writer effectively shows the importance of working together as a community. So they've given an evaluation. They've pretty much repeated the question, but they've started out by offering some kind of evaluation. And it does use language and structure points to underpin the critical judgment. That's the key difference between AO2, your language and structure question in question 3, and AO6, which is your AO4 question. You can use language and structure points in your AO6, in your AO4 response, question 6, but you do need to use them to underpin the critical judgment, not just say how the writer is doing something. The question doesn't ask how the writer is showing this community working together. They're asking how well. So you need to really answer the question. One way they do this is through the use of rhetorical questions. There's then an example, and then again, effectively may make the modern reader feel almost as if it is their duty to help. There's a little bit of explanation there and some informed judgment there. They're thinking about a modern reader, they're thinking about the reader of this particular text, and they're considering how that writer may feel in terms of how successful the writer is at getting the readers to help in the community. They continue to look at rhetorical question, but also rhyme. Again, it's underpinning the critical judgment there. And they then implies, in terms of tone, the childish and ignorant behaviour of the community, emphasising that challenging tone, slightly going more into the focus on language and structure and away from the evaluation there. But again, they come back to the writer effectively does this to show the importance and how many people it helps. So there is an explained, informed judgment. They try to vary a little at the end. The writer selectively chooses the word dedicated to show the community's pure desperation and union to end this social isolation. So it's a consistent attempt to evaluate how successful the writer is. So, to move higher into the mark scheme, if we look at the mark scheme for this particular question, again, bearing in mind our levels-based mark scheme, level 2 is commenting, level 3 is explaining, level 4 for this particular question is analysing, and level 5 is your evaluation and sustained detached critical overview. Well, the candidate has explained the ideas in the text. They do consider theme to a certain extent as well, so that bullet point in level 3 is achieved. Do they have informed judgment offered about the text? Generally, it is bordering on opinion and straightforward opinion, because they keep saying effectively and they repeat that quite often. But the selection of references is appropriate overall. So that is an example of a question that an answer that achieves a mark right in the middle of level 3. It does the explanation and it does a little bit of informed judgment with some appropriate references. So right in the middle of level 3, a mark of 8. Script 2. For this particular response, the candidate does start with an opinion that the writer is successful. The writer successfully shows the importance of working together as a community. There is some explanation after that. The writer mentions the problem, globalised world, more socially isolated, and then goes on to say this effectively shows that as humans in a modern world, we are relying more on technology to socialise for us. So there is a little bit of explanation there. It then starts to move more into exploring this. As a result of this, a communal kitchen where anyone, regardless of social status and identity, can go, can re-establish those human connections. This highlights the importance of working together as a community, and they've really started to try and explore that idea of the purpose of the communal kitchen. Again, gone back to making sure that they are giving an opinion, effectively showing that our reliance on technology is a growing issue, and successfully showing how ridiculous the situation of people not knowing their neighbours is. Consistent evidence here of the candidate giving informed judgment. There's some borderline level 4 achievement, but it doesn't quite get there. It definitely meets that first bullet point. It explains the ideas of the problem in society, the potential solution to solve it, reliance on technology, not knowing your neighbours. There's ideas in there. And there is informed judgment offered about the text. References appropriate and relevant, and this particular response just does a little bit more than the first one, than script 1, and achieves a mark of 9 in level 3. Script 3, the candidate is saying that the writer is successful. The writer successfully shows the importance of working together as a community. It's absolutely fine to continue to feel, well, I'm going to say it's successful and I'm going to keep on saying it's successful. If that's the viewpoint of the student, that's absolutely fine. But they do need to think about how well informed that judgment is and how detached that judgment is. Is that just their view? Could there be other people who think differently? And consider who is reading this particular piece. It talks about dependence on technology, moves into how the writer is showing community. The writer shows the importance in quite a few ways. He says two things: renew and re-emerge. These two quotes strongly show the importance of the community. So whilst that starts out being a little bit of an AO2 point, more of a how the writer is showing us rather than how well, they do move into saying strongly, and look at that. And again, backing up his point is there is evidence there to support the points that the candidate's making. Also, the writer talked frequently about social status, how it's become a popular subject. This shows the writer believes in the community work together. If the community works together, it will put an end to the social divide in the world we live in. At this point, the answer becomes a little bit more just giving an opinion rather than supporting it and developing it a bit more. We discussed this. There is explanation of the ideas in the text, the idea of coming together, the idea of social isolation, social status. There are ideas that are explained. It meets that first bullet point in level 3. And the references are appropriate. In most cases, they're relevant to the points being made. And the opinion is there, but it's more bordering level 2, level 3 than it is level 3. We did consider, should it achieve a mark just into level 3 of 7, but agreed that this would achieve a mark of 8 because there was enough in terms of the explanation of the ideas in the text to credit that as a mark of 8 in level 3. So that is script 3. Moving on to script 4, one of the points I would always mention to examiners is when you're looking at a script, it can be sometimes difficult to read a student's handwriting, and I'd always make a plea, as I'm sure you do as teachers, to your students to write as clearly as they possibly can. Given the fact that these answers are scanned onto a system, it is important that students' handwriting is clear enough to be read. As English teachers, we're all used to reading a range of handwriting, but it is quite hard to credit in writing questions vocabulary if we can't read what the word is, and it's difficult to check spelling as well. This candidate's handwriting can be a little bit difficult to read, but it is neat at the same time. This is an example of a succinct question 6 response. There is analysis of ideas. The writer successfully displays the positive results of working together, primarily through the use of we when addressing the people of Sheffield and asking if they can reclaim these empty spaces. They're using language and structure to underpin their evaluation. The use of we includes the reader in Sheffield's generous experiment and makes them feel connected to the author and the work being done in Sheffield. So there's a definite analysis of the ideas there. Whilst the rhetorical questions skillfully focus the reader to question if they've done their bit to make Sheffield a better place. So there's definite sort of fairly consistent, well-informed and developed judgment about the text. It's sustained throughout. We do see that. We see later on effectively shows them that they are missing out on a vibrant part of Sheffield. On top of this, the author uses emotive language to describe how projects are revitalising the city. And this definitely links back to evaluation of the ideas in the text. It is nicely succinct, doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't achieve the top marks. The The last point about the historical Commonwealth Cafe, which effectively teaches the reader something new about Sheffield's caring history and conveys to them the idea that helping others and working for the community has always been a part of the city. So in terms of where this response sits, we'd look at level 4. There is analysis of ideas in the text and the theme, the underpinning theme of the text of the city of Sheffield, the community broadly and specifically. And there is well-informed and developed critical judgment offered about the text. The selection of references is appropriate and it is quite detailed. It's embedded quite seamlessly into this candidate's answer. Does it achieve anything into level 5? Well, it is a fairly sustained judgment of the text, but again, we'd maybe say there could be a little bit more said. Is there some evaluation of ideas? We agreed that there was enough evaluation of ideas to just put the mark at 13, only just into level 5, given the fact that the candidate has that sustained sense of the ideas in the text and the attempt to evaluate them. To move higher in the level, we'd be looking for more discriminating evidence and also that detached critical overview of this particular extract. Finally then, script 5. This particular response, it's a competent response to the question. The writer of this extract successfully shows the importance of working together as a community. So again, there's that sense that I'm going to say the writer is successful, which is absolutely fine. And it does cover a range of ideas and links them methodically back to the question. So starts with the re-establishing human connections idea, links that back to the question with evidence. The writer further effectively shows the importance of working together using the event of the Commonwealth Cafe to sense some hesitance closing down. And there is a sort of methodical approach. I'm going to talk about events, I'm going to talk about ideas. The writer uses different identities to effectively show the mix of different people within a small town. The different identity, all these different problems, all need to be fixed. So it's a methodical answer. It looks at ideas, it looks at consistently evaluating them to the degree of it's successful, it's effective, and the references are appropriate and detailed. If we look at the mark scheme again, we look at level 3, there's explanation of the ideas. There are a range of ideas covered in this answer, and there is informed judgment offered about the text. The selection of references is appropriate and relevant, but it does do more than that. There is some quite analytical comment made on some of the ideas, and although for the second bullet point, which is that evaluative bullet point, we'd say it probably remains level 3, there's enough of the first bullet point in level 4 and the third bullet point in level 4 to give it a mark of 11 right in the middle, because there are appropriate and some detailed references which fully support the points being made. So mark of 11 in the middle of level 4. We're going to move on to look at question 7, which is the comparison question and selection of similarities question. There are 20 marks available for this question, and it is one question with two parts, part A and part B. It's important to remember that there is a second bullet point to A1, and question 7A looks at that particular bullet point, which is select and synthesize evidence from different texts. We're only assessing this particular assessment objective on paper 2. It's not assessed on paper 1, but it is an AO1 assessment objective, so students are not expecting to write a lot, which is why that part of the question is worth 6 marks. The main thing to remember for this part of the question is to consider similarities only, to make sure that the similarities are synthesized between the texts, that there is some connection between them, and also that they are linked to the question. In this case, the question asks, the two texts show how the store and food hall help their communities. What similarities do the store and food hall share in these extracts? So one of the difficulties with assessing these particular answers in this cohort was that quite a lot of students wrote about similarities between the texts. So they weren't focusing as much as they could have been on the question, which is the similarities between the two places, between these two places that do something. And that's one of the things I would encourage you to remind your students to do. Make sure that they are doing what the question is asking them. They're not just asked to say what's similar about each text. AO3 is only assessed in part 7b of paper 2, and for this particular section there are 14 marks available across 5 levels. We know that there's a lot to get through on this paper, and we're always impressed that students are always able to make some comparisons between the two texts that they've seen. The responses to 7A and 7B are marked together, so they'll always be marked by one examiner on our secure online system. And that's for various reasons. One reason being that 7A, if students for whatever reason write about differences in their 7A answer, they can receive some credit for that in their mark for 7B. They won't get credit for it in 7A, but they could be credited in 7B. The other thing it's important to say is if a student decides to just write out the exact same answer they've produced for 7A at the start of 7B, then they're not achieving additional marks for that. 7B asks for a different focus to 7A. So just repeating what you've already said, because it's one question, isn't credited twice. At this point in the exam, students have answered question 3, where they've been asked to talk about how language and structure is used to interest and engage the reader in text 1. And they'll have answered question 6, which asks them to evaluate how well a writer does something in text 2. So they've got a good idea of what is going on in both of the texts, and they should use that to inform what they're writing in 7B. These are really good comparisons to make. If you've said text 1 uses a lot of lists and you see that also in text 2, pick that out, pick that as a comparison, say what it's doing, say why they're doing it. So use the material that you've already produced in your answers to create another answer without creating too much work for yourself. So develop them through a link to the other text. Let's have a look at script 1. It's important to remember there are only 6 marks for 7A. Occasionally students do write a little bit too much for this question. There are only 6 marks available, so across the 3 levels we're looking at how students are synthesizing the evidence, how well they are showing their understanding of similarities, whether that is sound as in level 2 or whether it's detailed as in level 3. We do need to look at detailed in the context of this is an AO1 question. They're not expected to produce detailed responses in the sense of long responses. There's a little bit of misunderstanding from this student in 7A. There aren't many similarities between the two places here. Student starts with both texts similarly show the smaller or bigger scale things they do to help their local communities. We can link that implicitly to the two places though, so it's not necessarily a negative. And they've said what each text does. In text 1, Andrew talks about how they exchange their unwanted food. Text 2 similarly helps their local community, but instead of food, with knowledge. And what they've done there is comment on a difference more than a similarity. There is a similarity that they're both helping their local community, but that's the same similarity that's in the question. So we're looking at what overall we could credit there. So it can be credited for some reference and the general comment that's given on the smaller or bigger scale, things that can be done to help communities, but it's not particularly developed enough to move higher. So we awarded a mark of 1 for this particular response, taking into account that some of what they've written can be credited in 7B. Looking at 7B, it's a very, very brief response, but we can look at what they've already said in 7A, which is a difference there. Both texts, they talk about the importance of helping others around them and providing for people in need. So when we look at that in the mark scheme, we can say that the answer meets more than level 1. Level 1 says it does not compare the texts. This student does it. It does it very briefly, but it does it. And it therefore doesn't go very far into level 2 because there's limited reference. It has commented with some reference just at the end of the response to 7A, which is important. So we've given a mark of 3 for that answer, bearing in mind that we've credited part of 7A. So a total mark of 4 out of 20 for script 1. Moving to script 2. This student loses a little bit of time. As you can see, they've started a response to 7A, crossed it out, and then done a whole second response to 7A, which has just cost them a little bit of time. So again, it's important for them to make sure that they know what they're being asked to do in each question so that they don't fall into that difficulty there. They've said both texts talk about how the store and food hall help their communities, and there's some evidence there. Text 1, this is by families exchange their unwanted food, and in text 2, by the food hall helping revitalise the city. Both texts show that the store and food hall help the poor, so this is again second similarity. In text 1, by the store giving food to poor families. In text 2, by serving slum residents. The final similarity offered is a slightly tenuous similarity, and I don't think it's quite understood by the student. She says they're supported by art. In text 1, this is by you can colour it in with your Crayolas when talking about the sign, and in text 2, by supported by creative arts development space. So 7A, although there's some detailed similarities there, the synthesis of the last similarity is just not quite detailed enough. That sense of being supported by art isn't quite convincing enough a synthesis in order to achieve the full 6 marks for 7A. We've talked about how if you did just write out exactly what you've written in 7A at the start of 7B, that's not credited. You can use some of the ideas and similarities that you've used in 7A, you just couldn't use the exact answer that you've created. The reason for that is because the second part of the question is a different focus. It's asking you how the writers present ideas and perspectives about something, in this case the experiences of their communities. So whilst you can take some of the points that you've made in your 7A response, you couldn't just repeat it word for word as you might have done in 7A. This particular response starts with a very interesting comparison of the community segregated by race, and that comparison of segregation is quite a perceptive comparison. In text 1, segregation is by race, text 2, segregation is by technology. An interesting comparison to make there. So definitely more than the level of obvious comparisons. There is a little bit of repetition of 7A, but as we've said, it's not necessarily a negative in the sense of they've used it in a different way. Social segregation through differences between people is hinted at in text 2, and in text 1 the community is different, and text 2 also shows a different community there. In terms of where this would sit, therefore, in the mark scheme, we look at the levels. Does it consider obvious comparisons between the text? Well, it does more than that, so it's met that bullet point. Does it comment on writers' ideas and perspectives, including theme, language, and/or structure? Yes, it does that. And is the selection of references valid but not developed? Well, it's valid and it's more than not developed, so it's definitely moving higher than level 2. Does it quite get into level 3? Looking back at it, and very often when we're standardising, we'll have looked at these responses a number of times, and in the end we felt that we would place it at the top of level 2 rather than move it into level 3. We just felt that it didn't quite get to the range of comparisons that it could do, although that first comparison really made it look like it was going to go somewhere that we'd like it to, in the sense of being quite varied and comprehensive. So a total of 10 marks is achieved out of 20 for question 7 for script 2. Moving into script 3. Starts with a similarity. 7A is shown that the store and the food hall are a way of bringing the community together. And first of all, in text 1 gives an example. In text 2, the food hall is shown as a place where the community can renew relationships and can bring the community closer together. It's got more comment on text 1 than text 2, but there is a similarity explored, and that similarity is explored in some detail. The idea of bringing the community together. There is sound understanding of that similarity, and there's some clear synthesis as well. The evidence isn't developed enough and doesn't have a balance because of that focus more on text 1 than on text 2. Therefore, it would achieve a mark of 3, which is just at the lower end of level 2. This is one where the candidate has used the same answer for the first part of 7B. Again, using some of the ideas and some of the similarities that you have, if it answers the question about ideas and perspectives of experiences of the communities, you're very welcome to use that. Students can use that in their answers. But if you're just commenting on exactly the same or just copying exactly the same, that's not going to be credited. It has a different focus, so it's important to raise this at standardisation, because whilst students might think, well, it won't be seen by the same person, for 7A and 7B, the same examiner marks it, so they know that this has already been said. There is a comparison of the perspective of time and how this impacts on the two texts, the difference being that they both live in very different worlds. So the ways in which are needed to bring the community together are significantly different, and talking about the difference in technology. So there is a comparison right at the end there about, again, it's more of a comparison of the texts than the ideas and perspectives about the community experiences. So students need to be very clear about the question that they're being asked and make sure they're answering that question. So a mark of 3 is achieved for that response, which is a shame because they have simply repeated what they've put in 7A. So there is, whilst it's not necessarily an obvious comparison, you could argue it is. I mean, the two texts are set in different worlds. One is in the 1930s, one is in 2017. It's a fairly obvious comparison, but in terms of what they've said about it, they've made it a little bit more than obvious. But there's not enough to credit higher than a mark of 3. Looking at script 4, this response meets all of the bullet points we'd want it to achieve a mark of 6 in level 3. Both texts show the idea that revitalisation is a slow process. It gives evidence from text 1 and text 2. Both texts also show the idea of community service causing hardship, and again gives evidence from text 1 and text 2. In addition, both texts show the idea of food bringing people together, and again evidence from text 1 and text 2. There doesn't need to be that sort of point evidence explanation necessarily for this AO1 question for 7A. It is the fact that they have a detailed understanding of similarities. They've got a detailed synthesis between the two texts. They don't have to have detailed evidence to meet level 3. Level 3 says clear evidence, appropriate evidence, which is what this student has done. So a mark of 6 for 7A. This student again suffers a little bit from the getting into the question perspective, where they've crossed out quite a little bit at the beginning and lost a little bit of time. But it does have some comparisons identified, although some of the expression just makes them a little bit confused. For example, the student says, whereas one focuses more on the benefits seen by the community. It's not massively clear because both texts actually do that. But you can sort of see implicitly that they do understand a comparison there. The comparison of making food easier to access is a good comparison to make, although again, the student uses "on the other hand." Maya Angelou shows that members of her community enjoyed not having to even take their provisions home before trading. And "on the other hand" isn't quite the right expression there because it's a similarity rather than a difference, but again, that's not necessarily a negative there. There's some explanation of ideas which puts the response on the borderline of level 2 and level 3, and there are some appropriate references. So again, borderline level 2, level 3. There is an attempt to explain the writer's ideas and perspectives. There's definite that element of level 3 there, but they don't particularly consider a range of comparisons between the texts, although they do try to. So we did award a mark of 6 at the lower end of level 3 there, so mark of 12 in total. Again, for this student, doing a little bit more of what they're doing would just enable them to achieve higher marks. And that false start just means that they've lost a little bit of time where they could have made some additional points. Script 5. It's a succinct, detailed answer. Both store and the food hall provided an alternative to the norm. And again, piece of evidence from both texts there to support that. Both the store and the food hall were open to anyone and accepted anyone. Evidence to support that. Both the store and the food hall showed people used their own time to help. And again, evidence to support that. This candidate achieves 6 marks for this particular response. 7B, the student shows they're a little bit confused between the two texts, and they do get a little bit confused between the two, but there is explanation of ideas in the texts. The black and white community of stamps showing the community are mixed, and then they've said in text 2 this is similar because anyone can go to food hall and it's a mixed community. They talk about social status, segregation as a comparison, which is evident there, and there is a range of comparison touched upon: social experiments, themes of fun and joy, welcoming tone, how the writer is doing that in text 2. So there's touches of considering a range of comparisons between the texts, which is level 3. And there's some explanation of ideas and perspectives, even though there's a little bit of misunderstanding between the two texts. For this answer, we awarded a mark of 7, which is in the middle of level 3. There are touches of the first 2 bullet points, and the 3rd bullet point is met. The references are appropriate and relevant. Based on that, a best fit mark would be a mark of 7 in level 3. The total marks for script 5 then for question 7 are 13 out of 20.